All right, folks, so this is part 2 of this 2-part series on my industrial kitchen tech out, right? So in the first part, I gave you an entire tour of this 15,000 square feet facility that is state-of-the-art equipment, and we put some really cool tech in it. If you missed that, I'm going to link it somewhere up here. Make sure you watch that before you come back to this video. Now, in this video, I'm going to show you all of the different tools, all the different software that I am using to operationalize all of these things, to make whatever they're doing, to make business and technology indistinguishable for them. So without further ado, let's get started. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Elias Kinaser, and if you like this type of content, make sure you like, you subscribe, you share, you comment. This video, I am sure, is going to generate a lot of comments. There's a lot of tech being used here. I would love your advice on a bunch of things, so make sure you share down below. Hit that notification bell so that you are alerted the next time I upload a video. Now, so far in part 1, I showed you the facility. In part 2, I want to show you all the different tools that I'm using to operationalize it, to make business and technology indistinguishable. Now, we're gonna get started with the first thing that I get asked about the most, which is the sensor setup, the dashboard, how I got all of that put together. And I have a dedicated video on that I did a while back. I'll also link it somewhere up here. But here I wanna give you a little more in depth. So I am using this type of sensor. It's a Dragino temperature sensor. I bought these off of AliExpress. Let me show you kind of what they look like here. I bought them off of this website. Sometimes you'll get them for a better price. So it depends on when you're getting them. Make sure you go through. There's a ton of vendors that sell them. Do your due diligence, basically. But I was able to pick those up, and they work very well. They work in all of the coolers. They work in all of the freezers. Now, as far as the LoRaWAN gateway that I am using, this is the one that I showed you in part 1 as well. This is the one that we're using. It works really well. Now, the question then becomes, how do we get the signal that this thing is transmitting over to the gateway? Because this is a proprietary protocol. It's, LoRaWAN, it's MQTT, it's a bunch of protocols, right? Sometimes it could be Bluetooth, depending on the type of sensor that you have. But when they hit the gateway, now we got to get them onto the IP network. This is where the software that I'm using, which is called ChipStack, comes into play. ChipStack essentially will act as that translator between the physical hardware and the gateway. This will also allow you to store this data into a database. So I have this deployed on a virtual machine in my environment. Again, collects the data from the sensors, puts them into a database. And then what we do is we use Grafana to visualize the data. So this is where this dashboard comes from. The software that's making this happen is Grafana. We configure that, we point it to the database, and then, it's a relatively easy drag and drop. You can also find dashboards that others have created for Grafana that you can potentially use and leverage to your advantage and make these types of dashboards. This has been a lifesaver. It's also configured to send alerts via email and text messages, depending on the thresholds that these temperature hit, and depending on how sensitive it is and how long this temperature stays at a certain point. This dashboard has saved a ton of time. Again, I'll link to a video where I've gone a little more in depth on this setup and the reasons behind what were the business drivers behind putting something like this together. Now, the next thing that I want to tackle is my Ubiquiti deployment. I have a pretty decent Ubiquiti deployment, and I'm going to show you kind of the dashboards and everything so that you can visualize it. But I'm using a lot of Ubiquiti equipment. I really like Ubiquiti as a company. I do think they need a lot of work in terms of their support. I think they need a different tier of paid support, maybe for someone to pick up the phone and help. This equipment isn't just being used for it's not a hobby. A lot of us are using these for small businesses, and to just rely on chat, which is now answering basic questions, or to rely on email, and I think their email is somewhere around the world because I always get an email the next day. It's never the same day. It's always 24 hours, always 24 hours, always in the morning. So I suspect it's somewhere else. It's just not enough. And most times the support is, as soon as I hear Ubiquiti support say, send me the support files and send me this, and they'll just take you on a loop. Like every time they're asking you to send something, it's a week before you can get anything meaningful, if you get anything meaningful. So I'm gonna have a different video, I think, on me complaining about Ubiquiti support, because I think that's fair. But I do think they need a different tier of service so that people that really need it can actually pay and speak to someone and get their issues resolved. Nonetheless, I like the company, love the products. I think they have a lot of value for it. It's the right price. Now I'm using, let's start with what I'm doing with the network. I'm using the UDM Pro in all of the sites that I'm going to show you. I've got 3 primary sites here. And so I'm using UDM Pro. It's all the same types of hardware as much as possible in all of the sites. From a switch perspective, I'm using the 48 port PoE switch. This is the one that has 8 ports at the end of it. Essentially, the last 8 ports are PoE++, and the reason I have those is for the access hub that I'm using as well from Ubiquiti. As far as access points are concerned, I'm using the U6s, the U6 Lite. Those are really good. You can't beat them for the price. The coverage is fantastic. I'm not in love necessarily with how they're compatible with the smart sensor, because the smart sensor requires Bluetooth connectivity to an access point. And no matter how close you get that access point, unless it's literally on top of it, that smart sensor's connectivity is not great. This is not necessarily a ding on the access point itself, but there is a little bit of that's going on that I wish that there would be a way for Ubiquiti to address. The smart sensor, I'm still on the fence with, but it's doing what I need it to do for now, so no complaints. So I'm using that. I'm also using smaller switches here and there. I'm using the 10G aggregate switch specifically for ESX, for vSphere, and for my NAS. I've got uplinks of 10 gig there, and that works really great. Supports vMotion and gives me everything I need. It's overkill actually for what I need, but hey, why not? So again, I'm using different switches and different areas, especially if I have long runs. I've got a fiber going there, so I'll have another uplink to a switch, especially if there's a lot of cameras in one area. I'll put a switch and power it on via PoE. Everything as much as possible is PoE. I'm running the phones over PoE. I'm running the cameras over PoE. There's a bunch of things that are going over PoE in this setup. Now, the other thing that I'm using from Ubiquiti is Protect. Now, this is not the only security system that I have, but I am using Protect. We're also using the G4 doorbell. We're using the Smart Chime. Speaking of the Smart Chime, if there's one feature request that I think would be a lifesaver as far as I'm concerned for someone that's in the Ubiquiti ecosystem, would be for the Access Reader Pro, the doorbell functionality of the Access Reader Pro to be compatible with the Smart Chime. Now, I understand these are different development teams, different products, so maybe they haven't done that integration yet, but you have a lot of synergies here. This one's almost a no-brainer. I can't imagine it would be that difficult to do. That would be the one request that I would have would be for that Access the Access Pro to have connectivity to the Smart Chime. I think that would be incredibly helpful. Speaking of the Access Reader, I'm also using the UniFi Access. Now I'm using it on 4 doors in production. These 4 doors have these 3 reader light, and I'm using them as entries, not exit. They work really well. And the main entrance has the Access Pro. Now, the one thing that I've noticed here about these readers, they work really well. I haven't really had any problems with Access, but the one that I put outside, the Access Reader that I put outside, I'm in Chicago, so we do have extreme temperatures, but when this was installed, it was springtime. What I've noticed is when the sun directly hits that Access Reader, it'd be almost impossible for it to read anything else. You would almost have to cool it down a little bit. So I did put a plastic on it. Again, you saw that in the tour video. And since then, it's been working really well. It protects it against the rain, potentially the snow, but it's helping against the sun's rays. I haven't had anything, in the middle of July, it's gotten really hot here, and this thing has still worked very well. As far as fobs are concerned, I couldn't use the UniFi cards for a variety of reasons. I tried to pinch them and then all of a sudden they stopped working. I needed some way to be able to hang them on folks. There's these plastic slip-in cards that you can get so that you can use them, but it was just not functional. It was too bulky, everyone complained. So what I ended up doing was I got these fobs off of Amazon, and for our implementation, these worked really nicely. These are made of rubber. They can wear them, they can wash them, they'll never lose them unless someone forgot to put it on at home, and that's a different story. But those have been a really good hit. They're not very expensive, and they work really well again for our purposes. Those have been Great. So from a Ubiquiti perspective, we're using a lot of network switches, a lot of access points. We're using UniFi Protect, a lot of the different cameras that we're using. We're using the doorbell, the smart chime. We're using UniFi Access. Now there is one more product that I want to use from Ubiquiti. It's not in production yet, but I'm looking into it, which is Connect. I have one of these that I've purchased. I want to install it on the different TVs that we have around the facility and make it easy when we want to advertise something new. I can do it from a centralized location, bada bing, bada boom. It's across all of the different TVs. I'll make a different video on that, but that will be primarily more for the restaurant tech, I would say, not necessarily for what we're doing in the factory, but I will still show that. I mentioned the smart sensors. I showed you those in part 1 as well. We're using those right now. I'm just using them to detect whether the door is open or not, especially in these doors that are remote or in areas that are not frequently trafficked, like there's not a heavy traffic on there. I want to keep an eye on the door. So I needed a way to figure out if the door is open or closed. That gave me that functionality. Now I mentioned I'm not using all UniFi Protect cameras. I am using 5 megapixel cameras that I bought off of Security Camera King. I really like this provider, this vendor. They have excellent technical support. Anytime you call them, you're almost gonna get a call back the same day. The folks are very, very knowledgeable. The cameras work very well for our application. We don't need anything more than this, and it's working really well. Oftentimes, especially around events, around holidays, Security Camera King will do a sale. So if you're interested, take advantage of that. Again, I have no affiliate links. I'm not getting any kind of kickback. No one's paid me anything to mention any of these products across anything. I am my own sponsor of this video. The only thing I'll say is if you are interested in learning about cloud, specifically cloud strategy, and you haven't checked out my courses on Udemy, I will leave a link and also in the description for you to check out. And now back to our usual programming. Now, I've talked a lot about my Ubiquiti setup. I've talked about a lot of the products. I've showed you the physical products. Now let me show you the dashboard and kind of what it looks like. That way you can visualize what I have going on here. So I essentially have 3 sites. I have the factory, I have the restaurant, and I also have a site. This is my home setup that I use to connect. These all have site-to-site connectivity between them, so I can hit pretty much any resource from anywhere. We have a Protect deployment here that's part of the restaurant. In the restaurant, we have 2 security systems. Protect is one of them. There's 7 or 8 cameras. That's where that viewport, for those of you that have been following the channel, that's where I've been having some troubles with the viewport, but that's where that one is deployed. So there's a site-to-site connection between all of them. But let me show you a little bit of what's going on, what types of equipment do I have, kind of what that setup looks like. All right, here you guys are gonna have to excuse a little bit some of the stuff that's blurred out. Again, nothing fancy schmancy for me, but you gotta do what you gotta do. Again, those of you that are familiar with Ubiquiti are probably familiar with this dashboard, but this is the primary dashboard. I think what's cool is the topology here, and if I zoom in just a little bit, you'll see that the Dream Machine essentially has an uplink to the 48 port UniFi switch, and that becomes the core of my entire network, and it distributes everything up and down here. It's not, I wouldn't say this is a huge network, but it is a fairly decent sized network. Different switches in here, different access points, different hubs. There's a bunch of things that are going on. So again, not a huge deployment, but hey, that's what I'm showing you here. And then if we go to the device list, again, I'm gonna have to blur a few things, please excuse, but it is what it is. These are the things that I'm using as far as switches, access points. If I scroll down a little bit, you'll see some of the Protect stuff and a lot of the UniFi Access stuff that's in here as well. Now, as far as my storage, what's running Hulk, I'm running that using TrueNAS scale at the moment. Now, I've told you guys already that I'm thinking of moving on to Synology. One of my reasons for moving onto a Synology system is I really don't need the sophistication of a full NAS. I'm running about 15 virtual machines. If we ever push the limits, it'll get to 20. We're gonna be creating an intranet and a bunch of other things, but I would be surprised if we go above 20, but never say never. I've been in enterprises where we've said that, but this is still a small business. So I'm thinking of getting off of TrueNAS. I'm also using vSphere at the moment with 3 hosts. That I definitely want to keep. I know some of you are going to say Proxmox and some other systems, but I wrote the book on vSphere. I can't, I tried Proxmox, to be honest with you. I tried Unraid. The learning curve for me was just too much. I install ESX, and I feel at home. So I'm gonna stick with ESX, but if you guys have any recommendations on small form factor servers that are quiet, that will give me what I need, I'm looking at getting 3. That way I can build a real cluster and have some kind of redundancy and failover. But again, think 20 virtual machines, 3 hosts. I would love to get some recommendations there. Now, another tool that I want to show you that I really enjoy is called Guacamole. I mean, this thing is really cool. It's open source. I actually deployed it on one of the VMs. And what this thing does for me is this thing allows me to remote control the different servers that I have in my environment. So if you take a look here, you'll see I have a list. This is not all of them. These are some of the ones that I just started adding. It can do Windows, it could do Linux. I'm having some trouble with some of the Linux servers. I'm pretty sure I'm doing something wrong. I'm forgetting to turn on some kind of a service, but this is cool because from any web browser anywhere in the world, I've got a fully qualified domain name that's external facing that I can just jump into a server, do whatever I need to do, bada bing, bada boom, I'm off to the races. All right, so if I go back again, very easy tool, very easy to use, very, straight to the point, right? I like things that just work. And this thing, after you set it up, it was great. So probably one of my favorite tools, one of the best things that I've done was installed. Now, I've got a few things that I'm still considering. I'm really liking the idea of Jump Cloud as a centralized kind of identity management. I have a lot of SaaS applications that we're using here, and right now each of them has their own passwords. I'm trying to get Azure Active Directory to be kind of that single sign-on mechanism. Jump Cloud feels a little more, I don't know, cleaner, but I'd love your feedback as far as Jump Cloud as a replacement potentially for Active Directory and as a replacement for Azure Active Directory. Maybe an addition, maybe I should stick with Azure Active Directory. Not a super identity person, so I love feedback on what you would recommend there. So that's one. Number 2, I'm looking for some kind of an MDM software. Now I'm looking for something that is not going to break the bank. I don't want to pay by the device. If I can find an open source one, I wouldn't mind. Now, I come from the AirWatches of the world, the Zens of the world as far as Citrix is concerned, but again, I'm a small business. I don't have that many devices and I don't need something super fancy schmancy with a lot of bells and whistles. So I was looking at a bunch of things, including TeamViewer, but if there is an MDM tool out there that you recommend, if it's open source, if it gives me some basic functionality, I need to be able to do some support, make sure I can keep, iOS and Android always updated, that I would love to hear and learn from what you guys are using. And folks, that's everything that I'm using at the moment. Did I forget anything? I don't think so. These are all of the things. There are a couple of projects that I'm messing around with that could be interesting. We're building an intranet, even though that feels a little outdated, but I need a way for them to quickly access forums, and going through Dropbox can be a mess, especially if you're trying to tell someone where something is. So some one-pager type of intranet that gives them access to quick links to these SaaS applications, etc. While we're using 1Password to manage all of the passwords for the organization, we're using Dropbox, like I said, as a way to do structures of files. And again, we're not using the NAS for this because, well, they want their files on the go, so Dropbox made a lot of sense, so we're using that. From an ERP accounting system, we're using QuickBooks. We're looking to get onto another ERP system or a complementary ERP system. So there are a ton of things going, but from a tech perspective, I am trying to make tech in this environment as transparent as humanly possible for them to be focused only on the business and not necessarily on the tech. What did you think? Cool, not cool, maybe? What could I be doing better? Leave a comment below. Make sure you hit that like button, hit that share. I'd love to spread this video as much as possible. Make sure you leave a comment, hit the notification. Thank you so much for sticking with me to the end. I love you all. I'll see you in the next one.